It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a peaceful suburban neighborhood of Newport Beach, California. Mrs. Chen, a respected pediatrician and wife of City Commissioner James Chen, was home early from her clinic, preparing for a charity event she was organizing for the local children's hospital. The sunlight streamed through her kitchen windows as she sorted through donation papers at her dining table. Classical music played softly in the background, a habit she developed during her medical school days. Everything seemed perfectly normal until she heard heavy footsteps on her front porch. Before she could reach the door, it burst open with a thunderous crash. 3 plainclothes officers stormed in, guns drawn, shouting commands. Mrs. Chen froze, papers falling from her trembling hands. Her first thought wasn't for herself but for her teenage daughter, who would be home from school in less than an hour. "Get on the ground." Now, one officer bellowed, while another began ransacking the meticulously organized living room. The third officer kept his weapon trained on Mrs. Chen, who slowly knelt, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I'm Dr. Chen," she managed to say, her voice surprisingly steady despite her terror. "This is my home. There must be some mistake." The officers ignored her protests, continuing their aggressive search through the house. They overturned cushions, pulled books from shelves, and dumped out drawers. Family photos crashed to the floor, their frames shattering. Mrs. Chen watched helplessly as they destroyed the home she'd spent 15 years building with her husband. One officer waved a piece of paper in her face, a search warrant. But something wasn't right. The address on the warrant was 1647 Ocean Drive. Their house was 1674 Ocean Drive. Through her fear, Mrs. Chen's mind raced. As both a doctor and the wife of a city commissioner, she knew the importance of staying calm in crisis situations. "Officers, please check the address again," she said firmly, still kneeling on her floor. "You're at the wrong house." The officers exchanged glances but continued their search, though one of them did pull out his phone and make a quick call. Meanwhile, across town, Commissioner James Chen was wrapping up a city council meeting when his phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor: "Police raiding your house. Your wife inside. Something wrong." The commissioner's face drained of color. After 20 years in public service, including 5 as a commissioner, he knew exactly how wrong police raids could go. He immediately dialed his wife's number, but there was no answer. His hands shook as he gathered his things, making another call as he rushed to his car. Back at the house, Mrs. Chen remained on her knees, watching as the officers began to show signs of uncertainty. Their movements became less aggressive, their voices less confident. The one who had made the phone call was now scrutinizing the search warrant more carefully. That's when they heard the screech of car tires outside. Commissioner Chen's voice boomed through the front door before he even entered. "This is Commissioner James Chen. Stop what you're doing immediately." He burst into his home, not as a frightened husband, but as a man who had spent his career fighting for justice and accountability. Behind him was the chief of police, whom he'd called on his way home, along with 2 uniformed officers. The scene froze. The plainclothes officers lowered their weapons, finally realizing the magnitude of their error. The chief of police's face darkened with anger and embarrassment as he surveyed the destruction. "Get your officers under control," Commissioner Chen ordered the chief, his voice tight with controlled fury. Then he rushed to his wife, helping her to her feet and holding her close. She was shaking, but her dignity remained intact. The next few hours unfolded like a whirlwind. The chief of police personally apologized, promising an immediate investigation. News vans began appearing outside their home, drawn by tips from neighbors who had witnessed the raid. The plainclothes officers were placed on immediate administrative leave. But for Mrs. Chen, the trauma lingered. As she sat in her damaged living room that evening, surrounded by broken picture frames and scattered papers, she couldn't stop thinking about how differently things might have gone. What if her husband hadn't been able to reach the chief so quickly? What if she had made one wrong move while guns were pointed at her? That night, as news of the botched raid spread through social media and local news channels, the Chens received an outpouring of support from their community. Other residents came forward with similar stories of police misconduct, though none involving such a high-profile mistake. Their daughter, returning home to find her parents shaken and their house in disarray, showed remarkable strength. Instead of succumbing to fear, she began documenting everything with her phone, taking pictures of the damage and recording her parents' immediate reactions, evidence that would prove crucial in the days to come. As the sun set on that fateful Tuesday, the Chen family sat together in their kitchen, attempting to restore some normalcy by sharing a simple meal. But Mrs. Chen's hands still trembled as she lifted her teacup, and her husband's jaw remained clenched with determination. This wasn't just about a wrong address or a botched raid. It was about power, accountability, and the fundamental rights of citizens. Commissioner Chen knew that his position gave him the ability to fight back, to demand change, in ways that many other victims of police misconduct couldn't. As they cleaned up their home that night, Mrs. Chen thought about her patients, the children she treated, the families she counseled. How many of them had faced similar situations but lacked the resources or connections to seek justice? The thought strengthened her resolve to turn this traumatic experience into something meaningful. "We're going to make sure this never happens to another family," she told her husband as they finally prepared for bed, their home still bearing the scars of the day's events. "We have to." The commissioner nodded, already planning his next moves. This incident would lead to a complete overhaul of how search warrants were verified and executed in their city. But that was just the beginning of a story that would change their community forever. This was the day that transformed a routine police operation into a catalyst for reform, turning one family's terrifying experience into a movement for accountability and change. And it all started with a simple mistake, a wrong address that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. The morning after the raid, the Chen family woke to find their story splashed across local news headlines. Camera crews camped outside their home, and Commissioner Chen's phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow city officials, concerned citizens, and civil rights attorneys. She'd already posted videos of their destroyed home, careful to focus on the damage rather than any confrontational content that might violate platform guidelines. The response was overwhelming, thousands of shares, comments, and messages of support flooding in from across the country. Commissioner Chen emerged from his home office, where he'd spent the early hours making calls. His face showed the strain of a sleepless night, but his eyes burned with determination. He'd just finished a conversation with the mayor, who was equally disturbed by the incident. "The internal affairs investigation is already underway," he told his wife, sitting beside her. "But that's not enough. We need systematic change." He reached for her hand, noticing how she still flinched at sudden movements. The trauma was fresh, raw, and real. Meanwhile, across town at the police department, the chief was dealing with his own crisis. The 3 officers involved in the raid had been identified, and their records were under scrutiny. Officer Thompson, the lead officer, had a history of minor procedural violations. Officer Rivera had been on the force for just 18 months. Officer Patel, the most experienced of the 3, should have double-checked the address. The truth began to emerge. In their haste to serve a high-priority warrant, basic verification procedures had been ignored. The target address had similar numbers, but was actually several blocks away. A simple double-check could have prevented the entire incident. Back at the Chen residence, Mrs. Chen decided to channel her fear into action. She began writing down every detail she could remember about the raid, the officers' words, their actions, the sequence of events. Her medical training helped her maintain clinical precision in her documentation. Their neighbors started showing up with food, offers of help, and their own stories. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought over a casserole and shared how she'd witnessed the entire incident through her kitchen window. She'd recorded parts of it on her phone, crucial evidence that showed the officers' aggressive entry and their subsequent realization of their mistake. The local Chinese-American community rallied around the Chens. As prominent members of their community, the family had always worked to bridge cultural gaps and promote understanding. Now, their experience highlighted the fears many minority communities harbored about law enforcement interactions. By afternoon, Commissioner Chen had scheduled an emergency city council meeting. The agenda was clear: reviewing and revising warrant execution procedures. But he knew the real work would go deeper than policy changes. This was about changing a culture that allowed such mistakes to happen in the first place. Mrs. Chen decided to return to her clinic the next day. "My patients need me," she explained to her worried family. "And I need them. I can't let fear control my life." Her daughter hugged her tightly, proud of her mother's resilience but concerned about her well-being. The police chief made a public statement, acknowledging the severity of the error and promising full cooperation with the investigation. But his words rang hollow for many community members who had experienced similar, though less publicized, incidents. Local civil rights organizations began reaching out to the family. They saw this incident as an opportunity to push for broader reforms. The Chen's status in the community meant their story couldn't be easily dismissed or swept under the rug. That evening, as the family gathered in their partially restored living room, they discussed their next steps. Mrs. Chen spoke about the importance of turning their experience into positive change. "We need to think about the families who don't have our resources or connections," she said. "This isn't just about us anymore." Their daughter suggested organizing a community forum where people could share their experiences with law enforcement. "We need to show this isn't an isolated incident," she argued. "But we also need to work with good officers who want change." Commissioner Chen listened to his family, taking notes. He was proud of how they were handling this crisis, turning their trauma into a force for positive change. But he also worried about the backlash they might face. Police reform was always a contentious issue, and their high profile made them targets for both support and criticism. As night fell, Mrs. Chen received an unexpected call from Officer Rivera's wife. The young officer was devastated by his role in the raid and wanted to apologize in person. The Chens discussed it and decided to accept the meeting, not for revenge or confrontation, but for understanding and healing. The first day after the raid was ending, but the story was far from over. The incident had sparked a conversation that would echo through their community for months to come. It raised questions about police procedures, accountability, and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. The Chens knew their fight for justice was just beginning. They had the power to make real change, but it would require courage, persistence, and wisdom to navigate the challenges ahead. As they prepared for another restless night, they drew strength from each other and from the knowledge that their struggle could help prevent similar incidents in the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, meetings with attorneys, interviews with investigators, and the ongoing task of rebuilding their sense of security. But for now, they focused on supporting each other and planning their next steps in what was becoming a movement for meaningful reform in their community. The incident had shaken their faith in the system, but it had also shown them the power of community support and the importance of speaking up against injustice. Their story was becoming a catalyst for change, turning a terrifying experience into an opportunity for meaningful reform. The third day after the raid brought unexpected developments. Officer Rivera, the youngest of the three officers involved, arrived at the Chen residence with his wife. His face showed the strain of sleepless nights and genuine remorse. The Chens had agreed to this meeting, understanding that healing required dialogue, not just demands for justice. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea for everyone, including Officer Rivera and his wife. The living room still showed signs of the raid's damage, though most of the broken items had been cleared away. The officer's eyes darted around the room, taking in the consequences of his actions. "I've replayed that day countless times in my head," Officer Rivera began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were so focused on executing the warrant quickly that we forgot our basic training. I failed you, and I failed my badge." His wife reached for his hand, offering silent support. Commissioner Chen listened intently, his expression stern but not unkind. As a public servant himself, he understood the pressure officers faced, but he also knew the importance of accountability. Their daughter sat nearby, recording the conversation with everyone's consent, another piece of documentation for their growing campaign for change. The conversation lasted 2 hours, moving from the specifics of the raid to broader discussions about police training and community relations. Officer Rivera shared insights about departmental pressures and the culture that sometimes valued speed over accuracy. His honesty was both enlightening and disturbing. Meanwhile, across town, the internal affairs investigation was revealing troubling patterns. The rushed warrant execution wasn't an isolated incident. Similar mistakes had occurred before, though none involving such high-profile citizens. The chief of police faced mounting pressure to address these systemic issues. Local news stations picked up on these developments, and investigative reporters began digging deeper. They uncovered previous complaints about warrant executions that had been quietly settled or dismissed. The Chen incident was becoming a turning point in the community's relationship with law enforcement. Mrs. Chen returned to her pediatric practice that afternoon, where she found an outpouring of support from her patients' families. Many shared their own stories of police encounters, some fearful, others hopeful for change. Her waiting room became an unofficial gathering place for community members wanting to discuss police reform. One mother, cradling her infant daughter, told Mrs. Chen about a similar incident in her apartment complex the previous year. The police had raided the wrong unit, terrifying a family of 4. But without connections or resources, their complaints had gone nowhere. Mrs. Chen listened, taking notes, adding another voice to their growing collection of testimonies. Back at City Hall, Commissioner Chen was in a heated meeting with the Police Oversight Committee. "We need more than just policy changes," he argued, spreading out documents across the conference table. "We need a complete overhaul of how we train officers and how we hold them accountable." The committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Change was expensive, both financially and politically. But the commissioner had come prepared. He presented data showing the cost of lawsuit settlements from police mistakes, comparing it to the proposed cost of better training and oversight. Their daughter had been busy too. Her social media campaign had caught the attention of national civil rights organizations. She carefully managed the online narrative, ensuring it remained focused on constructive change rather than divisive rhetoric. Her posts highlighted both the need for police accountability and the importance of supporting good officers who wanted reform. That evening, the family received an unexpected visit from their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Wu. She brought traditional Chinese herbs for Mrs. Chen's nerves and wisdom from her own experiences. "In my youth in Hong Kong," she shared, "I saw how police could be either protectors or oppressors. The difference was always in how connected they were to the community." As they shared dinner with Mrs. Wu, the Chens discussed their next steps. The community forum was scheduled for the weekend, and responses were overwhelming. They had to move it to the high school gymnasium to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Officer Rivera's visit had added another dimension to their campaign. He had offered to speak at the forum, to share his perspective on what needed to change within the department. It was a brave decision that could impact his career, but he felt it was necessary for real reform. The chief of police, feeling the pressure of public scrutiny, announced new training programs and verification procedures for warrant executions. But the Chens and their growing network of supporters knew that surface changes weren't enough. They needed to address the underlying issues of police culture and community trust. Mrs. Chen spent the evening preparing her speech for the upcoming forum. She wanted to strike the right balance between acknowledging her trauma and focusing on positive change. "We need to build bridges," she told her family, "not walls." Commissioner Chen worked late into the night, reviewing proposed reforms with his legal team. They were crafting legislation that would require body cameras during all warrant executions, mandatory double verification of addresses, and community oversight of police training programs. Their daughter updated their social media platforms with news about the forum and Officer Rivera's participation. The comments showed a mix of surprise and respect for the officer's willingness to speak out. It was a small sign that change was possible when people were willing to listen to each other. As the third day drew to a close, the Chen family felt a shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a terrifying violation of their home was evolving into a movement for meaningful change. They had found allies in unexpected places and were building a coalition that crossed racial, social, and economic boundaries. The next few days would be crucial. The community forum would either unite people behind their cause or expose the deep divisions that often surrounded police reform. But the Chens were ready for the challenge, strengthened by their principles and supported by their growing network of advocates for change. As they prepared for bed, Mrs. Chen found herself feeling something she hadn't expected: hope. Despite the trauma, despite the ongoing challenges, she saw a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but they were no longer fighting alone. Their story had become a catalyst for the change their community desperately needed. The community forum at the high school gymnasium drew a crowd that exceeded all expectations. People from every neighborhood in the city filled the bleachers and chairs. The air buzzed with anticipation as the Chen family took their places at the front. Local news cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking steadily. Mrs. Chen surveyed the crowd from her seat on the stage. She spotted her patients' families, fellow doctors, neighbors, and even some uniformed police officers who had come to show support for reform. The diversity of the audience gave her strength. This wasn't just their fight anymore. Commissioner Chen stepped up to the microphone first. The gymnasium fell silent as he began speaking, his voice carrying years of public service experience and newfound purpose. "What happened in our home could have happened to any of you," he began. "Today isn't about pointing fingers. It's about finding solutions together." As he detailed the proposed reforms, heads nodded throughout the crowd. The new policies would require extensive changes: triple verification of addresses before raids, mandatory body camera footage review, community oversight boards, and enhanced training programs. But the most significant change would be in department culture. Then came the moment many had been waiting for. Officer Rivera walked to the podium, still in uniform despite pressure from some colleagues to distance himself from the department. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice was steady. "I've worn this uniform for 18 months, he began, "and until 4 days ago, I thought I was doing everything right. But being first through that door, seeing the terror in Dr. Chen's eyes, that changed everything." The gymnasium was absolutely silent as he described the raid from his perspective, acknowledging the mistakes made and the lessons learned. Mrs. Chen watched the audience as he spoke. She saw tears in some eyes, anger in others, but mostly she saw people listening, really listening, to both sides of the story. This was what healing looked like. During the public comments section, community members lined up to share their experiences. A retired teacher described being pulled over repeatedly for routine checks in his own neighborhood. A young mother spoke about her children's growing fear of police officers. A veteran police sergeant talked about the challenges officers faced and his support for the proposed reforms. The chief of police, who had initially hesitated to attend, stood to announce immediate changes in department policy. All warrant executions would be suspended pending a complete review of procedures. The 3 officers involved in the Chen raid would undergo comprehensive retraining, and their cases would be used as teaching examples in the police academy. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Chen finally took the podium. She spoke not as a victim, but as a healer. "In my medical practice," she said, "I've learned that treating symptoms isn't enough. We must address the root causes of illness. Our community is sick with fear and mistrust, but together, we can heal it. She shared how the raid had affected her family, not to assign blame but to illustrate the human cost of procedural failures. She described her continued jumpiness at sudden noises, her daughter's nightmares, and her husband's renewed sense of purpose. Then she talked about Officer Rivera's visit and what it taught her about courage and accountability. The forum lasted well into the evening, with small group discussions forming after the formal presentations ended. Police officers and community members who had entered as adversaries found themselves exchanging contact information, making plans for future discussions. Local businesses stepped forward with offers to fund new training programs. Civil rights attorneys volunteered to help draft legislation. Community leaders proposed regular meetings between police and residents. The energy in the room was transformative, fear and anger were giving way to determination and hope. As the crowd began to disperse, a group of young police academy cadets approached the Chen family. They asked permission to document the incident and its aftermath as part of their training. "We want to learn from this," one cadet explained. "We want to be part of the solution." Outside the gymnasium, television reporters interviewed participants, capturing the mood of cautious optimism. The Chen's daughter coordinated with social media influencers who had attended, ensuring their message of constructive change reached an even wider audience. Commissioner Chen spent time with city council members who had attended, securing commitments for funding and support for the proposed reforms. The incident that had started with a wrong address was catalyzing changes that would affect every aspect of law enforcement in their community. Mrs. Chen found herself surrounded by her patients' parents, many offering help with the ongoing reform efforts. One father, a graphic designer, volunteered to create materials for a public awareness campaign. A mother who taught at the police academy offered to help develop new training scenarios. As the family drove home that night, exhausted but encouraged, they discussed the day's events. The forum had exceeded their expectations, not just in attendance but in the genuine dialogue it had sparked between law enforcement and the community. Their daughter scrolled through social media, reading encouraging comments and shares from the event. The hashtag they'd created was trending locally, with thousands of people joining the conversation about police reform and community healing. At home, Mrs. Chen made tea while her husband reviewed notes from the forum. "This is just the beginning," he said, looking up from his papers. "The real work starts tomorrow." She nodded, knowing that maintaining momentum would be crucial for achieving lasting change. As they prepared for bed, Mrs. Chen realized she felt different. The trauma was still there, but it was being transformed into something powerful and positive. Their family's ordeal had opened a door for change, and people from all walks of life were walking through it together. The next phase would bring its own challenges, implementing reforms, maintaining community engagement, and ensuring that promised changes actually took place. But tonight, they could rest knowing they had taken an important first step toward healing their community and creating a model for change that others could follow. In the weeks following the community forum, real changes began taking shape. Commissioner Chen's office became a hub of activity as police reform legislation moved from proposal to reality. The incident that had terrorized his family was transforming into a blueprint for nationwide change. Mrs. Chen noticed subtle changes in her daily routine. Her patients' parents would share updates about police interactions in their neighborhoods, noting improvements in officer behavior. The local police department had begun sending community liaison officers to her clinic's parking lot during busy hours, not for surveillance but to build relationships with families. One morning, while reviewing patient files, Mrs. Chen received an unexpected call. A prominent civil rights attorney from Washington, D.C. had heard about their case and wanted to use it as a model for national police reform legislation. The attorney explained how their approach, combining accountability with community engagement, was exactly what other cities needed. Meanwhile, Officer Rivera had become an unexpected agent of change within the department. His candid testimony at the forum had inspired other officers to speak up about problems they'd witnessed. The old culture of silence was gradually giving way to one of transparency and accountability. The police academy implemented new training protocols, with cadets spending more time in community settings before receiving their badges. Mrs. Chen had been invited to speak to new recruits, sharing her experience from the victim's perspective. Her medical background helped her explain the psychological impact of police actions in terms the cadets could understand. Their daughter's social media campaign had evolved into a full-fledged movement. She worked with tech-savvy police officers to create an app that would help verify addresses and document warrant executions in real time. The project brought together young officers and community members who might never have collaborated otherwise. Commissioner Chen faced challenges too. Some resistant elements within the department pushed back against the changes, arguing that new procedures would slow down important police work. But he stood firm, armed with data showing how improved accuracy actually made law enforcement more effective. One afternoon, Mrs. Chen returned home to find an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a letter from Officer Thompson, the lead officer from the raid. Unlike Officer Rivera, he had initially remained silent. Now, after weeks of reflection and seeing the positive changes emerging from their mistake, he wanted to add his voice to the reform movement. The letter detailed his 20 years on the force, the gradual normalization of aggressive tactics, and his growing realization that something had to change. He asked for a meeting with the family, not for absolution, but to contribute to the ongoing reforms. The Chen family discussed the letter over dinner. Their daughter argued for accepting the meeting, pointing out how Officer Rivera's involvement had helped their cause. Commissioner Chen agreed, seeing another opportunity to bridge the gap between police and community. Mrs. Chen took longer to decide. The memory of that day still haunted her, but her medical training reminded her that healing often required facing difficult situations. Finally, she agreed to meet Officer Thompson, understanding that real change needed participation from all sides. The reforms began showing measurable results. In the 3 months since the raid, there hadn't been a single case of wrong address warrant execution in their city. Response times hadn't suffered. Instead, they'd improved because officers had better information and community cooperation. Local businesses noticed the difference too. Shop owners reported better relationships with patrol officers, who now spent time getting to know the community rather than just policing it. Crime rates started dropping as residents felt more comfortable reporting suspicious activity to officers they trusted. The Chen's story caught the attention of national media. News crews visited their city to document the changes, interviewing officers and community members about the transformation. Their daughter carefully managed these interactions, ensuring the focus stayed on positive changes rather than sensationalizing the original incident. Mrs. Wu, their elderly neighbor, hosted weekly gatherings where residents could meet with police officers in a casual setting. These community tea times became so popular that other neighborhoods started their own versions. Officers found themselves learning about different cultures and traditions while sharing their own experiences. The police chief, initially defensive about the incident, had become one of their strongest allies. He saw how the reforms were improving officer morale and community relations. The department's reputation was recovering, not through denial or defensiveness, but through honest acknowledgement and real change. One evening, as Mrs. Chen left her clinic, she noticed a police car in the parking lot. Instead of the anxiety she would have felt months ago, she felt reassurance. The officer inside waved. It was Officer Rivera, checking in during his patrol. This simple interaction symbolized how far they'd come. Commissioner Chen's reform proposals were being adopted by other cities. He traveled to conferences, sharing their experience and helping other communities implement similar changes. Their family's trauma had become a catalyst for nationwide improvement in police-community relations. Their daughter received an award from a national civil rights organization for her role in the reform movement. In her acceptance speech, she emphasized how change required participation from all sides: community members, police officers, and city officials working together toward a common goal. As the 5th month since the raid approached, the Chens prepared for another community forum. This one would be different, a celebration of progress and a planning session for future improvements. The gymnasium would again be full, but this time with people united in purpose rather than divided by fear and mistrust. Mrs. Chen stood in her restored living room, looking at family photos that had been replaced after the raid. The memory of that day would always be with them, but it no longer held the same power. They had transformed a moment of terror into a movement for positive change, proving that even the worst experiences could lead to something meaningful. 6 months after the raid, the Chen family gathered in their living room for a different kind of meeting. Representatives from the Department of Justice had flown in to study their city's transformation. The reforms that started with a terrifying mistake had become a national model for police-community relations. Mrs. Chen served tea, no longer flinching at unexpected sounds. The living room, once bearing the scars of the raid, now displayed awards and newspaper clippings chronicling their journey. But more importantly, it had become a place where police officers and community members could meet and talk openly. The DOJ officials were particularly interested in the data. Crime rates had dropped by 23% since implementing the new community-oriented policies. Emergency response times had improved by 30%, thanks to better cooperation between citizens and law enforcement. But the most striking statistic was that not a single wrongful raid had occurred since the new verification procedures were put in place. Commissioner Chen shared the detailed implementation plans they developed. The key, he explained, was making everyone feel heard: officers, citizens, community leaders. When people have a stake in the process, they work harder to make it succeed. Their daughter presented the success of the mobile app she'd helped develop. It had been downloaded by police departments in 12 different states, with more requesting access every week. The app's address verification system had prevented numerous potential mistakes, saving both departments and communities from traumatic incidents. Officer Rivera, now promoted to Community Relations Sergeant, arrived with more good news. The police academy had completely revamped its training program, incorporating lessons learned from the Chen incident. New recruits spent more time in community settings than ever before, learning to see residents as partners rather than potential threats. Mrs. Chen's clinic had become a model for community police healthcare partnerships. Officers regularly volunteered at her children's health fairs, helping build trust with young families. The sight of uniformed police reading to children in the waiting room would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But the Chen family's persistence, combined with support from both the community and reform-minded officers, had created lasting change. Late that afternoon, they received an unexpected visit. Officer Thompson, who had initially struggled with his role in the raid, arrived with his family. He had completed additional training and was now teaching other officers about the importance of procedural accuracy and community sensitivity. 6 months ago, I thought my career was over, Officer Thompson admitted, sitting with the family he had once terrorized. Now I realize it was just beginning. We needed this wake-up call, this chance to do things differently. The Chen's daughter showed everyone her latest social media analytics. The reform movement had gained over 1 million followers nationwide. Police departments from across the country were reaching out, asking for guidance on implementing similar changes in their communities. Mrs. Wu, their faithful neighbor, joined them with her famous dumplings. She had become the neighborhood's unofficial ambassador to the police department, organizing cultural sensitivity training sessions that had become mandatory for all officers. As evening approached, the DOJ officials prepared to leave, their notebooks full of observations and recommendations. "What happened here is remarkable," one official noted. "You've created a template that could transform law enforcement across the country." Commissioner Chen walked them out, discussing plans for a national conference on community-oriented policing. Their city would host it, bringing together law enforcement leaders and community activists from around the nation to learn from their experience. Mrs. Chen watched from the porch as patrol cars drove past their house. Instead of tension, she felt pride. Those officers were now part of a department that prioritized protection over power, service over force. The change was visible in how they patrolled, slower, more engaged, more connected to the community they served. Their daughter had received acceptance letters from several law schools, inspired by her experience to pursue a career in civil rights law. Sometimes the worst moments lead us to our true purpose, she told her parents, showing them her admission letters. That night, the Chen family sat in their backyard, something they hadn't felt comfortable doing in the immediate aftermath of the raid. The evening was peaceful, filled with the sounds of children playing in nearby yards and neighbors chatting over fences. "We did it," Mrs. Chen said softly, looking at her family. "We turned our nightmare into something positive." Her husband squeezed her hand, remembering the fear in her eyes 6 months ago, seeing now only strength and determination. The story of the Wrong raid had become something more, a testament to the power of community, the possibility of change, and the importance of turning pain into purpose. The Chen family had shown that even the deepest wounds could heal when people worked together for meaningful reform. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, they could hear the distant sirens of police cars. But now, instead of triggering fear, these sounds reminded them of the progress they'd made. Their community had transformed a single act of injustice into a movement for lasting change. The next day would bring new challenges, new opportunities for reform, and new chances to strengthen the bonds between police and community. But tonight, they could rest, knowing that their ordeal had sparked changes that would protect and serve generations to come. The Wrong raid had led to the right reforms, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the most difficult moments. The Chen family's story had become more than just a cautionary tale, it was now a blueprint for how communities across America could work together to create meaningful, lasting change in law enforcement.